viewers, and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I'm so glad to have you. I hope that you're doing well. If you're new here, hi, I'm Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I make videos about disability or disability adjacent stuff in science, history, education, and media. And in this series, we break down shows that either implicitly or explicitly involve disability to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be, work on our critical thinking and media analysis skills, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and talk about shows that involve disability. Always with a cool! That happened! Now what? Kind of mindset that doesn't point fingers but instead lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. As always, I have a playlist of all of the other theater deep dives I've done that I will link in the description below for you. While you're there, you can also find the source list for this video, the link to my Patreon if you want to support me, and early access to what I am up to. And I think the like and subscribe buttons exist somewhere down there along with the comments section, so do with that what you will. Also for friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown curly hair that is currently in a ponytail with some braids in the front to pull it out of my face. I'm wearing a navy blue button-up shirt with a tan tweed vest on top. I don't know if this is tan. It's in like the tannish grayish category. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Okay, that takes care of all the housekeeping, I think. Let us jump into the topic today. This video, also just to be clear, is about the 1980 Barnum musical, not The Greatest Showman. We will talk about The Greatest Showman a little bit. I am hoping to make one of these for Showman once it opens in the West End next spring if I'm both available and able to afford going to see it, but this is meant as a sort of precursor to that, as well as a sort of branch off of my How Freak Shows Built Broadway video from a few weeks ago, because each thing I learned from that led to a deep dive into something else branching off of that, and that will plague this channel for some time going forward. So, Barna, with book by Mark Bramble, lyrics by Michael Stewart, and music by Cy Coleman, opened at the St. James Theatre on April 30th, 1980. I could not find any records of anything out of town or of workshops. Statistically, those probably happened before this time, obviously. There is very little information about this musical available, hence why this is going to be one of my shorter deep dives. The show opened to generally positive reviews, though most of them commented on the considerable lack of depth in the show's book, but it was nominated for 10 Tony Awards. It won for costume, scenic design, and Jim Dale, who played the title role of Barnum, won for Best Leading Actor of a Musical. Also, just for historical note, Barnum's wife in the show, Charity Barnum, was played by Glenn Close, which I think is cool. The show ran for 854 performances and 26 previews, and it closed on May 16th, 1982. The show had a brief run in Paris that was just a commercial flop, and then it opened on the West End at the London Palladium on June 11th, 1981, where it ran for 655 performances, and then toured from 1984 to 1986, where it was filmed for VHS, which is how I got the chance to watch it. This production starred Michael Crawford just before he became the Phantom of the Opera, and he would win an Olivier for this performance. And every time I was looking at clips of the show, I was like, you looked at him and you said Phantom? I don't know how that happened, but I'm happy for him. The show has then kept popping up in the UK since then, with a Cameron Mackintosh production in 2013 and 2014, and Meniere Chocolate Factory had a 2017 revival of it, but it has never had a major revival in the United States. The plot follows Phineas Taylor Barnum from 1835 until 1881 as he rose to become the face of showmanship. We open with him giving a "Hey, come see all the wonders we have to offer" talk with an opening song called "There is a Sucker Born Every Minute," where he talks about how his whole career is built on humbugs, Barnum's word for trick, deception, or sleight of hand. We also meet his wife, Charity Barnum, who is much more sensible than he is and tries to keep him grounded. There is a throwaway line about her being a school teacher. I don't know why that's there. That was not the case, and I don't know why they made a line about it since they didn't really need the line to begin with. But we flash back to his very first act, an old formerly enslaved woman named Joyce Heth, who was allegedly the nurse of George Washington. We see him purchase the contract to display her, initially as the world's oldest woman, and there's no interest in her, so he decides to tell her to pretend that she was Washington's nurse and trains her to be a performer, and then they find great success together. His wife tries to talk him into giving up show business to get a steady regular person job in a factory, and he refuses, instead purchasing what was the failing Scudder Museum and turning it into Barnum's American Museum, which is incredibly successful until it burns down. So he acquires a chattel with dwarfism who he calls Tom Thumb, and an elephant named Jumbo, and they become his new star acts. He then becomes the manager of famed Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind, who he brings over for her first US tour based on her reputation alone, and discovers upon meeting her that she can't speak any English, and so he teaches it to her, and they have a little chemistry moment, and he decides to travel the country with her, leaving his wife behind. He eventually realizes that he's miserable without his wife, and so he returns home and he promises to live a more regular life, attempting to run a clockworks factory that goes terribly, then tries to run for office, which goes terribly, until Charity is like, spice up your campaign, and then he's elected the mayor of Bridgeport, and then Charity dies, Barnum hits an emotional low, and then when a guy named James Bailey appears offering him a chance to join the circus, he takes it and they form Barnum and Bailey Circus, and that's all that happens in this 2-hour runtime. So, my general view of the show is that it, with love, feels very 1980s. It's sort of in the vibe of how 1776 feels very 1980s. If this was a VHS that I had growing up, it would have fundamentally shaped my childhood because of how fun and colorful it is. I really would have enjoyed it, so I understand why it was open for so long, but from a modern and scholarly lens, most of the humor is, haha, sexism is funny! And like, Charity is a headstrong female character in a way that I liked, but all of Barnum's jokes were about the old ball and chain. And what they did to Jenny Lind just really bothered me because she was an equally headstrong and kick-butt lady. Most of the songs are nonsense or otherwise don't majorly expand on the plot, and the plot itself is incredibly thin. The show really rides on the charisma of its Barnum, something both Dale and Crawford had a massive amount of, but a great showman does not necessarily make a great show. I will say on the positives, the score is very heavy on big brass and chimes and other carnival-esque sounds, which is precisely what a Barnum musical needs and perfectly crafted a vibe, even if the songs themselves were fairly bland, and I now really need to know what a marching band style orchestrated Greatest Showman would sound like, and I want them to do that. They're not going to, but I want it to happen. The historical accuracy of the show is mostly within the limits of I guess that change sort of makes sense to streamline the history a bit for an audience, with the occasional just completely baffling choice, but it is much preferred in comparison to Showman's historical accuracy, which is like if somebody squinted at the Barnum Wikipedia page after it's gone through Google Translate a couple times from the other side of a room. The thing about the changes made to the history for this show is that sure, it simplified things, but also those changes didn't necessarily make it a better story or a stronger musical than it would have been if they had not changed those things. I don't know how common biographical musicals were in the 80s, I would assume a whole lot less than they are today, but this one falls pretty hard into the, well, that's a history I guess I wouldn't have otherwise known, but outside of cool, now I know that, it's not an interesting story category, which we see in a lot of jukebox musicals in the modern day. And I find this particularly infuriating in this case because of how well Barnum's own autobiography sold back in his day, largely because he was such an interesting person and such an engaging storyteller. So there's a world where that story could have been presented in a very interesting and engaging way that the show just wasn't able to accomplish. It had the spectacle, but it sort of uses that to distract from the story rather than accentuate it and make it an actually intriguing story. The Greatest Showman also got a bit caught up in this, but it was a bit more successful in creating a story, if at the cost of even the mere concept of historical accuracy. I'm truly very interested to see what Disney does with it when they bring it to the stage, because they have a tendency to make heavy rewrites, often with added dramaturgical depth when they move things from film to stage, but we'll see. My hopes are not high. But let's talk about the history for a moment. Both who P.T. Barnum actually was and the immensely complicated and tangled legacy he left behind. First thing to debunk is that the first song on the show is called There Is a Sucker Born Every Minute, which is a quote commonly attributed to Barnum that we have no record of him actually ever saying. The quote likely actually came from a banker named David Hannum, who was briefly a rival of Barnum's during the Cardiff Giant affair. But anyway, P.T. Barnum was born in Bethel, Connecticut in July of 1810 in a small community where most everyone was working a hodgepodge of things to get by, and the primary form of local entertainment was playing practical jokes on one another. He was also raised surrounded by lots of family, and he was the eldest of 5 siblings. He worked at his father's store starting when he was pretty young, being known in town as unusually quick with maths and a good negotiator, making him the perfect clerk. He also came up with many money-making schemes, one of his earliest being selling sweets to the soldiers on militia trading days before he'd even turned 12. A little later in his life, his big thing was running lotteries and selling lottery tickets, which he made a ton of money off of until lotteries were made illegal in Connecticut in 1834, which prompted him to move his family to Manhattan. That family being a local tailoress named Charity Hallett, who he married in October of 1839, and their eventual 4 girls, though Frances would not live to see her second birthday, unfortunately. Everyone said that Cherry was altogether too good for Barnum, to which he firmly agreed and married her anyway. He worked all kinds of odd entrepreneurial jobs for his early life, owning and running or clerking at various porterhouses and grocery stores in both New York and Connecticut. In 1831, at the age of 21, he got frustrated with the lack of separation of church and state and religious hypocrisy. He was a very faithful Universalist and had strong opinions on matters of politics and religion, and so he started his own newspaper known as the Herald of Freedom, and then kept getting sued for libel, once choosing to spend 60 days in prison rather than pay a fine because he thought it was religious overreach. He continued to write and edit his paper from prison, and upon his release, there was a full town-wide parade and celebration that he supposedly had nothing to do with, but had a little bit too much of the Barnum flair for that to probably be entirely the case. His first outing as a showman was in the middle of 1835 when he was approached by a man who said he'd recently sold an investment for a woman named Joyce Heth, who was supposedly over 100 years old and had been the nurse to George Washington. And and so Barnum travels to Philadelphia to meet Joyce Heth and quickly pulled together the money to buy her. Unclear if he leased or if he bought her, also sort of unclear if he was purchasing her as a person or her act as a concept, but it doesn't seem like he paid her any of what he made off of her, so I'm going to go with the theory that he was functionally engaging in the slave trade here. He may have reasoned that he had simply purchased an exhibit, and there's evidence that Ms. Heth saw herself as a performer with Barnum as her manager, but for all practical purposes, he had become the owner of another human being. She was supposedly a very entertaining performer, telling stories and singing hymns as her act, which she did throughout New England as toured by Barnum. He also sold pamphlets about her and did some money-making publicity stunts that were questionable, such as saying that she had enslaved great-grandchildren that he'd pay to emancipate if they raised enough money that he then almost definitely pocketed, and a mysterious article appearing in a local paper suggesting she was actually an automaton rather than a person that was very probably written by him to motivate people to come to see her to try to spot the hoax. Joyce fell ill in early 1836 and died in the middle of February, but Barnum wasn't done making money off of her, opting for a public paid entry autopsy in an operating theater where they discovered that she was likely no more than 75 or 80 years old. By all accounts, he has acted like he too believed that she was really as old as her papers said she was and was a good sport about it all. Barnum as a human was generally very against outright hoaxes and lying. He actually published a book later in life uncovering lots of different hoaxes and such. He seemed to justify a lot of his humbugs as a sort of, well, this story I told was maybe a little bigger than what it was, but you get to think critically about things, and also you'll still be entertained, get your money's worth, so it's all good fun. He saw himself as not somebody who deceived or charlataned or ever lied. He just expected some suspension of disbelief and a sense of wonder from those he sought as audience members, and promised that no matter what, they would have a good time and get their money's worth. I have complicated feelings on that, especially when the all-in-good educational fun things are incredibly racist, like this one was. He often walked the line of whether or not something was false advertising. We'll talk about ethical quandaries later, but the Joyce Heth affair is one he particularly seemed to feel a little weird about later in life, despite it being the thing that really began his career. During the Panic of 1837, which was a major recession, Barnum spent time on the road with various traveling acts, initially with Aaron Turner's Circus and later with his own. In 1841, he would buy Scudder's American Museum that had been financially failing for a hot minute on Broadway and Ann Street and turn it into Barnum's American Museum. He covered the roof with flags and a giant limelight, the walls of the building with giant animal paintings, and added a bunch of exhibits. Now, when we think of museums today, we usually just think of things on display, but his museum also included an aquarium, a menagerie, which is like an early zoo, gardens, a large lecture hall for circus-style performances, moral dramas and educational talks, freak show-style displays, performances of native ceremonies. Literally anything you can think of was probably there. If you want to know more about the history of museums, I have a piece about that in my history of disability in performance throughout all of history, so I will link that above for you if you want to check it out. They also had nightly fireworks shows, and children were always welcome at half-price tickets, and he knew that by making his exhibits seem wholesome and educational, as well as constantly changing them, he could count on upper-class folks coming to visit and return. He also wanted theater to be a respectable and wholesome place, which in this era it simply was not seen as, so he rebranded it, and this is part of the reason we view theater publicly today as the thing that it is. One of his most famous humbugs was the Fiji Mermaid, a June 1842 gift from Moses Kimball, a close friend of Barnum's who ran the Boston Museum, which was a clearly handcrafted specimen that combined the top half of a monkey with the back half of a fish. The history of these particular creatures is very interesting. They were actually somewhat common, but that is a story for another day. I also believe that there is one on display at the Sideshow Museum, or the Coney Island Museum on Coney Island. I have yet to get a chance to see it, but I do think that they have one, last I checked. Anyway, he advertised it as a real mermaid and crafted a dramatic backstory for it, and initially showed it before putting it on exhibit at a concert hall as part of a lecture from the fancy Dr. Griffin, who had recently arrived from Pernambuco. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Dr. Griffin, of course, being one of his friends in a white coat, doing what was probably a pretty terrible, if not downright offensive accent, but they seemed to more or less get away with it, initially at least until it was exposed as being a hoax, definitely, by a naturalist in 1843. In 1842, Barnum also signed Charles Stratton, a 4-year-old boy with dwarfism from Bridgeport, Connecticut, who he billed as the 11-year-old English General Tom Thumb, who would become one of the most famous actors of his time, initially for a 4-week exhibition tour that ended up becoming a very long partnership. Charlie traveled with his parents and eventually became equal contract partners with Barnum, who taught him well, and they were very close for much of their lives. On his English tour, when he was 7 years old, Charles Stratton would meet Queen Victoria, and she was utterly enamored with him. The story goes that supposedly one of her dogs charged at him, and he fought the dog off with his teeny tiny little cane. She invited him back another day to meet her children, as the initial meeting had happened after their bedtimes, and European royalty and nobility were particular fans of Charles Stratton, so they would go see him perform often. While Barnum is abroad, his daughter Frances dies before her 2nd birthday, and Charity is struggling with often being ill, and he did not return upon hearing of her death, and when he did make his return some months later, decided to greet his wife with a practical joke. I'm honestly surprised she didn't kill him on the spot. Good on her. He then tried to bring the family abroad, but they left early, with Charity hating traveling and also being pregnant at the time. She typically stayed home with the girls while he would travel the world. In the late 1840s, Barnum took up the cause of temperance and worked to become more of a family man after having traveled almost constantly for over a decade, and they built a palace-like house called Iranistan in Fairfield where he and his family lived. It is also at this time he learned of an opera singer named Jenny Lind, who he decides that he wants to bring on her first US tour, signing her without having ever heard her perform. He had a bit of a desire to be seen as someone sturdier than a promoter of humbugs, collector of curiosities, and manager of a dwarf. So it seems inevitable that Barnum would develop an interest in Jenny Lind, would seek to raise his own status by associating himself with a singer favored by the greatest composers in Europe. Jenny, much like Barnum, was also very devout and had built herself from very lowly means. She had a strong reputation for her modesty and purity, which likely had a huge hand in her success at a time when opera performers were not generally seen as the most respectable of people. She was also an incredible philanthropist, often giving much of her money away to various organizations whenever possible. Later in her life, she only ever did concerts for charity. An incredibly cool woman who was consistently dragged in the mud by stories about Barnum, and it deeply, deeply bothers me. She made her US debut at Castle Garden in September of 1850. Castle Garden no longer exists as that specific venue, but if you've ever been to visit the Statue of Liberty and stopped at Castle Clinton, an old military fort, which is where you can buy your Liberty Island tickets, and there's also free public bathrooms there if you ever need a place to pee, that is actually the site of Castle Garden. I was there just a couple months ago and I heard a ranger mention Jenny Lind just like as a side note, and I was like, hello? And I got talking with the ranger and I learned that military fort was turned into a theater for some time, and that was where she ended up making her debut, which I think is really cool. That location was also the temporary version of what Ellis Island became before Ellis Island was built, and there was an aquarium there for some time as well, but it was restored to the original fort design it had been before Castle Garden came along, after there was a threat to demolish the entire thing altogether. So if you do want to check that out and be where Jenny Lind was, you can go do that. There's some pictures in the little visitor center and they're really cool. Anyway, the tour was an immense success, though both parties decided to end it early after only 93 of the planned 150 performances. Jenny would also marry her pianist from the tour, and they would retire from public life for a time to raise a family on the money made from the tour. She earned what would today be about $5.3 million. Barnum then partnered with Sherwood Stratton, Charles's dad, and Seth B. Hose on a traveling museum and menagerie circus situation which hit the road in spring of 1851. He also invested in other things, not all of which were successful. The one that would become a big issue for him was pairing with Jerome Clock Company, where it seems like he was taken advantage of, if I understand correctly. The finances of this particular situation are a bit confusing to me, but he ended up having to declare bankruptcy in 1855 because of it, which he, in his autobiographies, makes it seem like it was a huge shock that caught him off guard, even though in the years prior he had transferred a bunch of his assets, such as the museum and all of its contents, into the hands of his wife and his close friends. He would manage to make back all of the money he owed in his debts within 4 years and bought back his museum, which is impressive. Iranistan, his home, would burn down in 1857, the first of many fires to come. This man had really bad luck with fire. His American Museum burned down in July of 1865, which he handled like an absolute leader, immediately staging concerts to keep his people employed while he quickly refurbished a different old museum to house his new, bigger and better American Museum, which would open in the fall of the same year. This museum would burn down in March of 1868. In that time he would not rebuild, and he would make an attempt to retire, but unsurprisingly, real bad at retiring. Barnum also served 2 terms in the Connecticut legislature in 1865 and 1866, specifically because he wanted to vote for the anti-slavery amendment, and he actively campaigned for black suffrage as well as chairing the Agriculture Committee. Iconic. He was also the mayor of Bridgeport in 1875 and served 2 more terms in the General Assembly in the late 1870s, where he put forth an amendment to abolish capital punishment, and he later ran for a congressional seat, but he lost. He joined with William C. Coop on his circus as a name to put on posters and a talent scout for the 1871 season, and began to build that circus up, continuing his travels in search of a new talent. His wife died in 1873, and within just a few months he would secretly marry Nancy Fish, the daughter of one of his close friends, later marrying her publicly less than a year after Charity's death. He would later divest from Coop's circus and focus on his own traveling show, and in 1880 the first elephant conceived in America was born in Philadelphia at the winter quarters of the Great London Circus, run by a guy named James A. Bailey, and Barnum reached out to them asking if he could purchase this baby elephant, and not only did they decline, but they used the fact that Barnum had interest in it as a selling point. And Barnum knew he'd finally met his match, offered to partner with them, combining their circuses into what would become Barnum and Bailey's greatest show on earth. 2 years later, in 1882, Barnum sourced Jumbo the elephant from London's Royal Zoological Gardens in Regent Park and brought him to the United States, where he was incredibly beloved. He traveled with the circus until his untimely death in September of 1885 after being struck by a train. That story is devastating, and the bond between him and his human was just incredible. We won't go into it today because I'll cry. Anyway, Barnum would continue doing circus things until his death on April 7th, 1891 at the age of 80, working pretty much right up until his death. And I think what this Barnum musical was really missing was how much this man was simply not at home, and how that was what created the tensions between him and his wife. I found it really odd how much they ignored the extent of this man's travels, because that is such an easy point of contention and conflict for them to use in a plot that they chose to ignore, and also would have given him more interesting things to go do because he was traveling so much. I also felt that it made Jenny Lind come off as some sort of airheaded diva when she was absolutely anything but, even though that's how she's often portrayed in the media, because I guess a scandalous affair between the two of them is narratively fun. Personally, I think that does a disservice to her memory as an incredible performer and philanthropist. The show also really just shoves Jumbo the elephant in there about 40 years too early. I'm less mad about that, I just thought it was like oddly out of place more than anything. But there are elements of Barnum's story that can make an incredibly interesting narrative that I felt were just completely ignored here. This man lived a life where he was constantly taking risks, and they paid off as much as they very much didn't, and sometimes he got seriously humbled and had to decide how to handle that, often deliberately choosing to throw his own reputation temporarily under the bus to make someone else, who was making him money, look better. He was also incredibly politically active, despite being often criticized as a lying showman at the time, both benefiting from and struggling with his own reputation in a way that is a very unique conversation on legacy that isn't often had in art. Usually we just talk about legacy after someone dies, or their obsession with it while they're alive in the case of Hamilton, but I don't think this fits into either category, really. Barnum also changed his mind a lot over the course of his life, like going from owning enslaved people to helping enact emancipatory legislation. He regularly talked openly about his failures and where he messed up and apologized for it. He also did a lot of philanthropic work. He was incredibly involved in the building up of Bridgeport and taking care of his community. He also often paid his minority performers equally with himself and treated them as fairly as possible, which for the time was definitely not standard. It's no secret that this dude was quite the prick for like most of his life and took advantage of a lot of people, specifically Joyce Heth and probably his first wife as well. But it also seems like he very genuinely grew over time to some degree, and he was clearly a very strong businessman who was very good at what he does, supposedly for the goal of education and fun, on top of obviously being for making tons of money. But I do believe that to some degree he did believe in the cause of frivolity as much as he did in that of a cash flow. I mean, he created a newspaper at the age of 21 and ran the thing himself just to get better political information in the hands of the public. He definitely had opinions on education. So there is an interesting story that could be told about personal growth and legacy and struggling with the shadow of a past that you've outgrown. This is a particularly fascinating historical case of that, one where you wouldn't have to glorify the man or drag him through the mud, but just tell his story and wonder how he might have felt about that. That would be a lot more entertaining than just a list of the stuff that he's done. Overall, I have very complicated feelings about the guy himself, and thus by extension how he's portrayed in the media, because for practically his entire life this man has represented something beyond himself. He was Yankee brashness personified, and the kind of American dream that to the upper classes felt like a threat, which to some degree led to a lot of the societal narrative that we have about him because of how those people, often who were writing the papers and controlling the narratives, wanted people to see Barnum, often turning him into a joke and a hack and all of that. But also, at the same time, people had every right to not quite trust him. He told all kinds of stories about himself. He was well known for his humbuggery, and he rarely denied stories as told by other people, unless they were super incredibly bad, but even that was pretty rare. To this day, a lot of modern criticism directed at Barnum specifically calls him out for creating harmful things he didn't create. He was just the most famous person to do them, which kind of feels unfair, I don't know. But at the same time, he also, of course, deserves criticism for his racism and for all of the issues of disability exploitation. So bringing up The Greatest Showman for a moment, a lot of the criticism of that film centers on, well, he exploited disabled people for profit by creating the freak show, so he was a bad man and the film should portray him as such, in a sort of all freak shows are bad kind of tone that's simply not historically accurate or what I agree with. And we talked about this in my recent freak shows video that I've already plugged several times in this video that, again, have linked everywhere if you haven't seen it already. But the freak show as a sociological concept has been around since the medieval era, and honestly since ancient Egypt. It's been around forever and it is still going strong today. It has always been a part of just about every single human society we have record of, so putting the weight of that on Barnum's shoulders is just grossly inaccurate. He did usher in the era of the freak shows we think of as we think of freak shows today, sure, but even then the ethics of that are complicated because many freaks saw themselves as performers, and they were. Charlie Stratton, for example, was absolutely a performer, and he was supposedly incredibly good at it. And this idea of, oh, they're all just being used against their will and this is exploitation, is a bit of a savior-esque concept that denies the autonomy of performers. We can acknowledge that consent was absolutely an issue if this was really the only job majorly available to these people, often the only option for them outside of institutionalization. Is this something they would agree to do under different circumstances? And that's obviously not something we can quite know, and the ethical discussion can go in so many directions, and we will never quite land on a solid answer. It's murky and it's always going to be murky. Like, think about the ethics of how reality reality TV works today and the tricky questions of consent there. That is one of the most common versions of the modern freak show, and while different from this for a number of reasons, it actually has a lot of the exact same ethical quandaries. Barnum definitely took advantage of Joyce Heth and some of his other exhibits while he was amicable with performers and paid them incredibly well, often accentuating their difference for profit, sometimes in very racist directions, isn't fantastic. And I don't want to say, oh, everybody was doing this and Barnum was one of the ones more ethically doing it, so actually it's okay, because I don't mean that. But it does feel complicated to single out him as somebody whose story we need to correct without acknowledging that wider historical context. Often people will talk about Barnum's contract with his freak show performers and say that he practically owned these people and how unethical that is. Stratton is a common person people point out as being essentially enslaved by Barnum. But the more that I hear about these people and these contracts, the more I'm realizing how similar they are to modern performance contracts now that I've seen a handful of them. Like, signing a 4-year-old as a performer maybe is not great, but do we villainize people who do that today? Yeah, kind of. Depends on the person who's doing it and how they're going about it. So while I am all for, hey, let's stop completely glorifying this man in media, particularly with Showman, where they make him a sort of savior to these poor, sad, disabled people who hate themselves until he makes them see they're worthy of something, I also wonder if much of that criticism is coming from us trying to retrospectively impose our modern interpretation of something onto history to make ourselves feel like we've grown and like, oh, we don't do that anymore as a society. Society has become better since that happened, when much of the same things are still alive and well today, just packaged a little bit differently. And Barnum himself is a tad caught in the crossfire of that, mostly because media about him is one of the only times we actually confront freak show history in modern context at this point. But that brings us to the disability of the show, which I don't have a lot to talk about. Honestly, to a degree where I almost scrapped this video, but I worked hard on researching the Barnum stuff and I wanted it to become something, so here we are. I actually want to first talk about how they treated Joyce Heth as a character, who was a disabled woman. That's not why she was put on display or what she's known for, but she was. I don't love how she was initially a sort of comedic effect situation. Like, these white men are just sort of pawning off this woman who can't stop singing and playing piano horrifically off key and isn't aware of how bad she is until Barnum manages to convince her to play a specific part and teaches her how to do it, and suddenly she's a perfect performer. I think to a modern eye that actually does a really great job of encapsulating the feeling of like, maybe that wasn't a great thing for him to have done for an audience member, but that was not the intention of how that was originally written, and I'm quite sure of that. Historically, she was a great performer with a mediocre showman, then replaced by Barnum, who was a good showman and brought her to higher levels of fame. Just overall, didn't love how that was handled with that historical context, also just with general racial context, didn't feel great. I appreciated that it was included, given that Showman and many other versions of Barnum's story like to sort of sweep the slave-owning situation completely under the rug. This also isn't the only time that he owned somebody. He briefly owned 3 enslaved people when he was touring the South in the 1830s. But I still think this could have been done way better, but also race stuff written in the 80s. I'm not the most surprised, unfortunately. Then there is, of course, the Tom Thumb of it all. I'm not sure if this is in the script or not. I couldn't track down a copy of it, but it seems to be a consistent design and casting choice across every version of this musical I could track down, so I'm inclined to believe that it is in the text. Basically, we see Barnum go and talk to Charlie's parents, and then there's a small boy with his back to the audience sitting in a chair in front of them. The parents keep saying they're not sure about signing the contract, so we ask the boy directly, and the boy gives him a thumbs up, which then becomes Barnum's idea to call him Tom Thumb, who we then see as a young man in forced perspective with a giant chair, and then all the supposedly average height people around him are on stilts. And in theory, this is very whimsical. It just also completely erases Charlie as a disabled person altogether. This entire musical is centered around Barnum's love of the humbug, of the trick and the game, and so to an audience, this looks like, oh, Barnum just made this maybe slightly shorter than average kid seem small to be Tom Thumb in a cute and creative way, when that was not the case. He was a disabled person who had a disability. The only aspect of this that I think it does preserve is that Charlie Stratton had pituitary dwarfism and was thus completely proportional. He just didn't grow. This specific type of dwarfism is extremely rare today because it's caused by lack of growth hormone and can be reversed with injections of that growth hormone, but I really don't think that preserving his proportions is more important to acknowledging that he was genuinely a little person, and an incredibly important part of disability history, which is just completely ignored in this show. I will mention that short-statured actor Billy Barty, while the show didn't end up opening on Broadway as planned in 1972, was supposed to be in a Broadway show almost a decade before the Barnum musical came along, and he did end up being in a Broadway show in 1991. I've added that one to my list to look into. So the idea of little people existing as actors in a professional theatrical capacity very much existed at this time. This was a specific choice that was made by the creative team. It was well before the conversation of authentic casting really majorly started, so I'm gonna cut them a little bit of slack on this, but it wasn't unheard of at this time either. Also, side note, if you're not familiar with Billy Barty, he was an incredibly talented actor and also super cool dude. He's created the Little People of America organization. Look into him, he's awesome. Tom Thumb's song in the show is also very full of on-the-nose jokes about being tiny, but that's also how most of his genuine performances were, and even how he wrote letters. So while narratively that's a tad annoying and potentially making the character pretty unidimensional, even though though every character in the show is pretty unidimensional, it is actually perfectly on brand for the historical Tom Thumb, so I will give them that. When it comes to the now what and the what we do with this musical, yeah, we should cast a little person as Charlie. I'm always going to campaign for authentic casting. I would personally vote that it's probably time the show is laid to rest, not just for its weird handling of race and disability and just the blatant sexism throughout, but also that the specific pieces of what made this a good show to do regionally and in school programs are done better in many other less problematic and newer shows. If you want a male star vehicle with acrobatics, you can do Pippin, you can do Water for Elephants, both of which are now available for licensing. Both also sort of sidestep the disability aspects of circus life altogether. I may do a Pippin video at some point, but they're both stronger pieces than this one is. Matilda also has some circus elements in it. I honestly have a feeling the show is going to be further buried once Showman hits the stage anyway. It doesn't seem like it's licensed very often at the moment. I can only imagine how that's going to continue to be the case going forward. But that's all that I have for this one. This definitely takes the record as my shortest dramaturgy deep dive video, but there ended up being a lot less to talk about than I anticipated, so here we are. At the very least, we learned something new about the show and about Barnum himself, which will definitely come in handy in the near future, hopefully. So with that, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.